Bring myself to the stage. We are live. This is Unregistered Live. This is the official live stream of the Unregistered Academy. To take a look at the Academy, what we're doing, the courses we're teaching, the conversations we're having, the experts we're bringing in to discuss the major issues in history and philosophy and current politics, go to unregisteredacademy.com. The link is in the description. Tonight, I will be presenting a preview of our upcoming course, our upcoming live course, which begins next Tuesday at the Academy. Israel and Palestine, the origins of the Gaza war. This is an updated version of this course. It will be presented live for all members of the Academy next Tuesday, and anyone who purchases the course individually. You can do either to take the course. As I said, you can buy it a la carte or become a member of Unregistered Academy. Live streaming memberships are available, as are streaming video memberships. So you can participate live, or you can simply watch it by streaming a video whenever you want. Go to unregisteredacademy.com and become a member. So we will tell the story tonight of the origins of the relationship between the United States and the State of Israel. There was very little relationship of any kind between Americans generally, and certainly the US government, before the 1940s. But there were two key events and developments leading up to the 1940s that began to spark interest among Americans, and in particular American political elites, about interest in the Middle East region generally. This is, of course, before Israel was established in 1948. I'm talking about the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, when virtually no Americans thought about the Middle East, and it was almost a non-issue in American politics. But that changed in the first half of the 20th century, in particular with two key events, the first being this one. The first discovery of oil in Western Persia, which is now Iran. This is on what is now the Iran-Iraq border. That is a picture of the actual oil well, the gusher that resulted from drilling in that area after many years of exploration. And this was a British project, by the way. The British were the first to discover oil in the Middle East. And this is when a few American experts and politicians, etc., started to take notice, because this is also at the time of the advent of the automobile industry, which of course is taking off or beginning in the United States. And so there is a very, very acute awareness of the need for oil to literally fuel this new emerging industry. Then 20 years later, an even bigger oil reserve was discovered and tapped, this time in Saudi Arabia, in a place called Dammam. Saudi Arabia, again by the British. And this right here, at the end of the 1930s, is when the State Department of the United States began to take notice and began to express concerns about the United States' presence in this region because of what appeared to be vast oil reserves. And this, by the 1938, of course, the automobile industry in the United States was one of the largest industries in the world and central to the rise of the United States as a dominant economic power. So going, and then of course World War II begins in 1939, and Franklin Roosevelt and his cabinet are obviously primarily concerned with the wars in the Pacific and in Europe. And Roosevelt himself had very little interest in the Middle East at the time. So it was sort of laying dormant through World War II. Of course, during World War II, we have two major developments that lead directly into the founding of the State of Israel. One is, of course, the Holocaust. And the second is that through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, as oil is being discovered in the Middle East, and as the automobile industry is burgeoning in the US, Zionists, the first Zionists, a movement that began in earnest in the 1880s, but picked up a lot of steam in the 10s and 20s, especially the 1920s. Hundreds of thousands of Zionists had settled in Palestine by the 1940s. And of course, the Holocaust gave great impetus to that. So even more Zionists moved into Palestine during the war. And so you had hundreds of thousands of Jewish Zionists settling, occupying, or one could say colonizing Palestine. By the end of the war, there were close to 500,000 Jewish Zionists living in Palestine. So these are converging historical phenomena. Discovery of oil in that region, the rise of the automobile industry and the centrality of oil in the industrial global economy, and the settling of hundreds of thousands of Zionists in Palestine demanding independent statehood. Now, later on, when he wrote his memoirs, Truman, Harry Truman, who was president, of course, after Roosevelt died, and then was elected in 1948, he revealed quite a thing. And this is amazing for most people now that we see how the United States relates to Israel as an eternal ally. But at the time of the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, Truman was surrounded in his own cabinet, in his own administration, by fierce opponents of a Jewish state in Palestine. He said this about his cabinet and his departments in 1948. He said the Department of State specialists on the Near East were, almost without exception, unfriendly to the idea of a Jewish state. Their thinking went along this line. Great Britain has maintained her position in the area by cultivating the Arabs. Now that she seems no longer able to hold this position, the United States must take over, and it must be done by exactly the same formula. If the Arabs are antagonized, they will go over into the Soviet camp. Now, he's describing the thinking, the dominant thinking among his own State Department. They believe that if the United States recognized the State of Israel and allied itself with the State of Israel, it would antagonize the many, many millions of Arabs living in and around Palestine and would cause them to join with the Soviet Union in an alliance against the Jewish state and any of its benefactors. He then says the military kept talking. Now he's talking about the Defense Department. So it's both State Department and the Defense Department were dominated by anti-Zionists at this time. Again, an amazing thing to comprehend given where we are now with the relations between the US and Israel, but this was true. The military kept talking about two things: our inability to send troops to Palestine if trouble should break out there, and secondly, the oil resources of the Middle East. So there is also clearly an awareness or a concern among many, many US government officials that not only would we push the Arabs into the Soviet orbit by recognizing the State of Israel, but the Arabs there might disrupt the flow of oil in protest of recognizing the Jewish state in Palestine. These were prophetic words, as we all know now. Here are just some. These were just the leading figures in the Truman cabinet in 1948 who were avowed anti-Zionists, who opposed the very idea of a Jewish state in Palestine and fiercely opposed the idea of the United States allying with that project. Robert Lovett, who was Undersecretary of State, Dean Acheson, who is considered to be one of, if not the most important foreign policy thinkers in the 20th century, served in multiple cabinets, and he was at this time the foreign policy advisor to Truman. He became Secretary of State the following year, but he was in and around the White House through this time, advising Truman closely on world affairs. Charles Bolin, counselor of the Department of State. George Kennan, of course, the dean in many ways of U.S. diplomacy and U.S. diplomatic thinking. He was director of policy planning at the State Department at this time, which was a key position, really kind of the intellectual leader of the State Department from the 40s through the 50s. James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense. We're going to spend some time looking at him. And none other than George Marshall, the Secretary of State, the eminent World War II hero. In many polls among Americans, George Marshall was considered to be the greatest living American hero for what he had done during World War II. All of these men, and these are the leaders of the foreign policy establishment. Again, this is remarkable, but it's true. These were the leaders of the foreign policy establishment at the time, unanimously opposed to the state of Israel. So why? What were their arguments? James Forrestal, the defense secretary, had several things to say. Truman characterized his arguments thusly in his memoirs at the top here. He said, Forrestal spoke to me repeatedly about the danger that hostile Arabs might deny us access to the petroleum treasures of their countries if we were to recognize Israel. And then Forrestal himself, in his own diaries, which were published posthumously in 1951, we'll talk about that in a moment, said, no group in this country should be permitted to influence our policies, speaking to the Zionist lobbyists, and they existed. In fact, they were quite powerful, not as powerful as AIPAC is today, but through the 1940s, there were Zionist lobbies working diligently in Washington, D.C., trying to get the ear of Truman and other members of the State Department. So that's who he's referring to. No group in this country should be permitted to influence our policy to the point where it could endanger our national security. He believes that, believed that recognizing Israel would have constituted a threat to the U.S. itself. He says, I am deeply concerned about the future supply of oil for this country, not merely for the possible use in war, but for the needs of peace. I expressed it as my opinion that unless we had access to Middle East oil, American motor car companies would have to design a 4-cylinder motor car sometime within the next 5 years. Of course, all American cars at that point were either 6 or 8 cylinders. So he's saying that we will have to invent a new, smaller engine because we will have less oil to run it on. You fellows, he says to Clark Clifford, who was the White House counsel. He was one of only 2 supporters of the state of Israel in the White House, in the Truman White House. This is what Forrestal said to Clifford. You fellows over at the White House are just not facing up to the realities in the Middle East. There are 30 million Arabs on one side and about 600,000 Jews on the other. It is clear that in any contest, the Arabs are going to overwhelm the Jews. Why don't you face up to the realities? Just look at the numbers. Again, quite prophetic, I would say. George Marshall, again, widely considered to be the greatest American hero of the 20th century, and certainly at this time in 1948. This is just 3 years after World War II. He said, if the tide did turn adversely, he's speaking about the victories of the Zionist armies in Palestine. They had succeeded in driving out, of course, the Palestinians from much of the territory that became Israel. So they were celebrating their recent victories. And he says, if the tide did turn adversely and they, the Israelis, came running to us for help, they should be placed clearly on notice that there was no warrant to expect help from the United States, which had warned them of the grave risk which they were running. And he says this to Truman himself at a very tense meeting in May of 1948 when members of his cabinet were brought into the White House to discuss whether to recognize the new state of Israel. And he says this remarkable thing, George Marshall to Harry Truman in the White House. And this, again, was an election year, 1948. Truman was running for president. The election would happen in November. This is May. George Marshall says, if you follow Clifford's advice to recognize the state of Israel, and if I were to vote in the election, I would vote against you over that issue alone. This is how serious the opposition to the state of Israel was inside the U.S. government, inside Harry Truman's own cabinet. As I said, there were two men in the cabinet who did support recognizing the state of Israel, and they ended up, of course, winning the day, at least winning Truman's mind. Clark Clifford, who was White House counsel, and David Niles, who was an ardent Zionist, and he was one of Truman's junior advisors at the time. And these two kind of collaborated in building an argument to present to Truman. And the argument was twofold. One was essentially moral, which was the argument made by most Zionists, especially after the Holocaust, which was that the Jews are historically oppressed, historically stateless, therefore historically defenseless, and needed a homeland, a safe haven that they controlled, over which they had autonomy and sovereignty, that would serve to protect Jewish people into the future. And the other argument made by Clifford and Niles and some of the Zionist lobbyists who visited Truman was that it's an election year. And many Jews at that point, by 1948 in the United States, were quite wealthy. They were also a significant part of the Democratic voting base, especially in the Northeast, in New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, places like that. These were the core states, electoral states at the time. And Jews, certainly nowhere near a majority, but they constituted a significant, quite vocal, quite activist group within the Democratic Party coalition. Clifford and Niles and others argued to Truman that you need their support. You need the support of Jewish voters in this coming election to win, to beat Dewey. And that is the argument that won. I mean, it's unclear. I mean, Truman has said things that look as if he does have or did have some sympathy to the Zionist cause, to the idea of a Jewish safe haven and homeland in Palestine. But we do know that Truman said this 2 years before he made this decision to recognize the state of Israel. He said this in a cabinet meeting. He said, I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents. So, of course, Truman does recognize the state of Israel. The United States is the first country to do so. The Soviet Union is the second country to do so. And after that, Truman welcomed the new president of the state of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, to the White House, where Weizmann gave Truman a Torah. Truman then 4 months, 5 months later, 6 months later, wins the election defeating Dewey. This is a famous photo. The Chicago Daily Tribune got the results wrong and published this famous headline saying that Dewey had actually defeated Truman. So Truman loved using the opportunity for these photo ops to revel in his come from behind unexpected victory. Jewish support for Truman was significant. He did receive considerable funding and other forms of support from Jewish American Democrats and Zionists. And, we can't say definitively that that's what pushed him over the top, but it certainly helped in his electoral victory. Now, another thing happened. A year later, less than a year later, in May 22nd, 1949, James Forrestal, the former Secretary of Defense, who was the most outspoken anti-Zionist in Truman's cabinet, fell out of, or leapt out of, or perhaps was pushed out of a window on the 13th floor of the Naval Hospital, now known as the Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. Now, I think he was there being treated for depression or a mental disorder. And I am not here saying that I believe that the state of Israel or agents of Israel were responsible for his death, but I am saying that we should keep it in mind because we know, in fact, many books have been read by pro-Israelis, in fact, about Israel's long history of assassinations of foreign leaders, most of whom, of course, were Arab or Palestinian. But this has been a primary modus among Israeli intelligence services since the founding and since before the founding of the country. I mean, we don't have any other evidence besides what I've presented to you, but I do think it's something to keep in mind and ponder and further explore. So that is the history of the origins of the relationship between the United States of America and the State of Israel. We will examine the full story, the full history from the early origins of Zionism, which actually was among Christian evangelicals in Great Britain and America earlier in the 19th century. We'll take that story all the way through to the Gaza war, which continues to this day, unfortunately. But you should take a look at our website, unregisteredacademy.com. The link is in the description. Also, the link for the course itself, Israel and Palestine, Origins of the Gaza War. That link is also in the description. Take a look, click around, and I hope to see you in class. Thank you.